I was remarking how amazing it was for us to be practicing a technique that's been codified for about 2,500 years. Generations upon generations upon generations of people have practiced this very profound, very simple, and very not easy technique of being aware of the body, of making this fundamental distinction between narrative awareness and direct experience. And it's interesting how this practice, sort of generated in northern India, how it's made its way around the planet. It sort of made its way down into, Sri Lanka and into the jungles where it kept kind of the orthodox quality. It didn't really change much because there wasn't much external input. So if you learn in that tradition, you learn the very, you basically are learning what the Buddha taught, in the Theravadan tradition. And then people started telling other people about it. You got to try this. Something happens when you do this. So it followed the trade routes. It went into China, went into Tibet. In Tibet, it took on all the animistic qualities. And when you look at Tibetan Buddhism, it's wild. All the wrathful deities and the colors and the horns and all that stuff. And then it made its way up into Japan and took on the whole flavor of that culture. And you get a very distinct experience in that flavor of Zen Buddhism. And then it made its way into Korea, and you kind of have the koan experience, the kensho experience. And then it made its way to the West. And what do we do with it? Well, we slice it, we dice it, we measure it, we see if we can duplicate it in a laboratory, we see if we can really prove this is effective using blind double studies. There are over 10,000 studies on the brain and what happens when you practice this technique. And it's really cool, because what we're finding is that all this stuff is corroborated in the evidence. Jean Houston once talked about the discovery of what she called ancient future technologies. When you hear all the mystical teachings of the rishis and what develops, and it's all described in this sort of esoteric, flowery language. But now we're actually seeing what happens. When you practice this technique, this part of the brain lights up. That when you experience metta or loving kindness, there's a part of the brain that is related to your perception of other and separate self. That changes. We can track it in the brain through functional MRIs. So I'm really interested in kind of what we could call pragmatic Dharma. How do we take these teachings that have been around for a long time and actually apply them in practical ways that not only create a greater sense of ease in our lives, but actually lead to a greater sense of freedom? Because there are two basic paths. One is the path of means, the path of self-improvement. That's the path of becoming a better partner, a better listener, healthier, more flexible. The other path is the path of liberation, the path of real freedom, of cutting through. And this practice leads to both. We tend to, when we practice, we tend to feel better. I was sharing earlier, in feeling better, we can feel our joy better, we can feel our compassion better. We can also feel our sadness and our grief better because we become more sensitive. The bandwidth of what we can actually contain and be aware of naturally expands. But also, you begin to see into the three marks of existence. You begin to see that everything is in a constant state of change. And it's not just an intellectual understanding. You begin to see it in your own experience. And then you begin to see the nature of suffering in relationship to change. We begin to see, not just in our seated practice, but in our lives, that how you relate to change has a direct impact on the degree to which you will suffer. If something isn't changing and you want it to, there's stress and suffering. And for the opposite as well. And then you begin to see into the nature of who you really are. You begin to see that the story that you are telling yourself is also subject to change. All of this comes out of this very simple and fundamental practice. So I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about how do we apply mindfulness, or as I like to think of it, non-judging awareness, or non-judging presence, which is the fruit of our practice. How do we apply it in practical ways, in relationships, in how you work with others? All of us are associated with organizations, whether you're working or retired. We're always bouncing into each other. There's a really interesting book by Susan Stone, who's one of the teachers at the Charlottesville Insight meditation community. It's called The Kosambi Intrigue. It's a novel. It's a cool novel. I recommend it. I enjoyed it. And it's set in the Buddha's time, about 9 years after the Buddha's awakening. And it's in one of the early communities. And it's about some of the strife and the intrigue that comes out of these communities with the political influences going on. It gives you a really cool flavor of the Buddha's time. One of the things I took away from that talk was a recognition of how when we are in community together, inevitably there's conflict. The interesting thing about life, of course, that when it's not working out, when you're really, really frustrated, the one consistent thing is you. You're always there. And we get to see how we show up in relationship to each other. When we begin to really explore mindfulness in life, we begin to recognize, as one of my teachers said, that life is therapeutic irritation. There's one of our men's groups, they kind of have a shortened term for it, where when they're talking about what they're working with, that someone will say, well, I've got a really big AFGO right now. Another frickin' growth opportunity. So back in the Buddha's time, there was a tremendous amount of strife in community. And even with having kind of an awakened teacher present, a lot of struggle, a lot of political intrigue, a lot of people sort of like demeaning others so they could be seen in a greater light by the teacher. And it was interesting to read about it, but I also thought, wow, if they couldn't do it then, what kind of hope do we have, now, just with all the confusion and all the stress of our culture? Most of our time goes into either avoiding domination or dominating others. Just part of the kind of the built-in wiring of our biological beings. We're the product of our conditioning. When things aren't going your way, chances are you have some pretty predictable ways of acting out. Some of us are outrage waiting to happen. And some of us are rejection waiting to happen. The bad news is that wherever you go, there you are. All of your conditioning is just dormant, waiting to be stimulated. The good news is that you can develop mastery and skill in how you communicate and relate to others through mindfulness. We could call this relational Dharma. It's easy to feel clear when you're sitting in a cave. In fact, many years ago, before I stumbled into an ashram, I came for lunch. I stayed for 24 years. I was actually on my way to study at Maharishi International University. And you may recall that they have the program called the Siddhi program, where you'd practice these very specific techniques in a very, very intensive training. And through those specific techniques, you would start to manifest certain, well, the literal translation of a siddhi is a suture. It's like a power, like a mental power, greater clarity through deep concentration. I mentioned this to the guru in the ashram where I lived. I was on my way here. And he said, well, you could do that. You could go meditate in a cave and get very, very clear, and very, very calm, have great insight. But the minute you walk down the road and someone insults you and you react, all of that is worthless. And he said, why not work on purifying your desires, purifying your capacity to relate to others in a clear way, and observe what happens through that practice as well. And that really touched me, and I took that on. The basic teaching, from what I can tell, like the core teaching is to train yourself to see yourself in others and others in yourself. How do we do that in a pragmatic way? How do we actually apply that? Because what we naturally do is we think that we're separate. As Tara likes to say, the world is divided into people who think they're right. That's the end of the statement. Have you ever been in an argument with someone and realized that you're wrong? It's a really interesting moment. How quickly do you invest into defending yourself? And how quickly can you recognize, I'm wrong? Interesting moment of mindfulness. So this is a little bit of a rambling story, but I hope it will have a point to it. When I lived in the ashram, it was a very kind of big, expanding, growing ashram, and for a number of years I did fundraising. And there was a fair bit of pressure to raise money because we were doing these huge capital projects, and I was a huge believer in what we were doing, so I was really into it. And I started to really study how could I be better at asking people for support, because I believed in what I was doing. And I ran across an interesting book called Influencing with Integrity. And I thought, wow, okay, I want to learn that. And basically what it was kind of an overview of neuro-linguistic programming, of kind of learning how people think and how you can gain rapport with people. And part of it is recognizing that we tend to process information either visually or more through the auditory channel, or some folks are more kinesthetic. They're more feeling oriented. And when you really pay attention, you can begin to sense if someone, what modality they use primarily. Visual people tend to talk really, really fast. They use their hands a lot because they're trying to show you what they see inside. And they actually use words like, can you picture this? Oh, no, imagine this. They're thinking in pictures, and they can be challenging to be around because when they're really visual, they know exactly what it's supposed to look like, and they're not satisfied until it looks that way. You know anyone like that? Auditory people they speak in, their voice is a little more moderate. They'll actually use words like, that sounds really good. Or, no, that doesn't ring a bell. Because they're processing through sound. Kinesthetic people, they're more sense-based. So their way of speaking is usually, a little, it's like it's slower. Because it's, it can be really hard to, to find the words. It's really interesting when you begin to identify these styles, particularly when you identify who you're living with. Because someone can say, I just don't feel like you love me. Say, are you kidding me? I cooked you this beautiful breakfast. I set it on the plate where you could look out into the garden this morning. Yeah, you don't touch me. So that's part of recognizing how people process information. So it was a fascinating study for me. And I found myself coming around to well, how does a $1,000 check sound to you? If you were to write a check today, what number do you see on it? And another part of this is recognizing that people like people who are like them. So you may be familiar with mirroring, which is, quite a people know this, that when you mirror another person's physical posture, on an unconscious level, they start to think, wow, this person's just like me. And you find that you can really gain rapport. You can make people feel safe. There's a shadow side to this as well, because you can actually manipulate people. And the shadow side is very real. So I was practicing. I got to practice this every day, and it became quite a study for me. And I really enjoyed, learning how to do it. And then at one point, I was beginning to lead meditation retreats, these 7 days and 21-day meditation retreats. And I was pretty young in the ashram, but I was loving doing it, just loving teaching meditation. And I was told that the next meditation I was going to be leading, maybe my third, so I was pretty insecure in leading, that my assistant director was going to be one of the most senior people in the ashram. And the day before the retreat, he was coming back from doing a 10-day retreat. I didn't know this person at all, but I heard all these stories of how difficult he was to work with, because he, was very dominant personality and so forth. And I was terrified, because I wanted to create a safe retreat, and I didn't want to have this, psychic battle in the background for who was going to be leading it. So I realized I could try these techniques and see if that would work. And I was terrified. Also, he was not a tall person, so I was about double his height. And so I didn't want to, so anyway, he came into my office for a meeting, and he sat back and crossed his legs, and I sat back and crossed my legs, and he leaned forward, and, I would lean forward, and he put his left arm back, I put my left arm back. At one point I thought, if he knew I was doing this, he'd probably punch me right now. And then he would talk soft, and I would talk soft. And then there was sort of this moment when I thought, this is sort of easing, And right at that moment, he stopped, and he leaned forward, and he said, I am so excited to be working with you. And he looked either side, he said, there are very few people who think like us. And he said, I want to support you in being director, and we had this wonderful love fest, and it was all great. When I reflect back on that experience, my initial desire to create rapport with this fellow, I had a purpose to it. There was an element of wanting it to go my way. But what I found, that what I really had to do in that process was to really come into rapport with him. When he would move his body or speak in a certain way, and I would mirror it, I actually got to sense who he was. I actually got to imagine what it was like through his perspective. And all of it, of course, was just happening sort of through the body, and yet something shifted. There is an element, a transformational element of relational Dharma, which has to do with the role reversal. Your capacity to really sense and imagine what it's like for the other. That when you can do that role reversal, something happens. There's an experience I have when Tara gives me a certain look and she says, "We need to talk." I know it's good for me. I know I'll be glad at the end that we talked, but I am not looking forward to that initial conversation. And now I can laugh about it because, kind of what we say is the person who does the first role reversal wins. That is to say, the argument is over. That when you can listen to another and say, I think I get it. I can really sense the frustration you must be feeling right now. As soon as that's done, it's like you've reached in and you remove the detonator, the capacity to cultivate empathy for another. So I thought it might be interesting for us to do a little reflection, a little practice time on a role reversal. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might bring into mind someone with whom you have a sense of separation. There might be a complaint. You might have a sense of frustration. You might like to not choose your biggest arch nemesis, but maybe scale it down a little bit just for the purpose of practice for a few minutes. And it might be helpful to kind of clarify a moment or a situation. You might visualize a moment of conflict or frustration with this person. You might see this as a moving picture or maybe as a static image. You might actually explore brightening the colors a little bit, if that's possible. And you might explore the auditory element to this. Are there any words or sounds that you associate with this memory or with this experience? And now exploring the kinesthetic. What does it feel like inside when you reflect and investigate this relationship, this situation? Can you locate that felt sense inside? And now you might bring your attention to reflect on the other. What mood or emotion do you imagine the other is experiencing? Do you have a sense of what the other's unmet need might be? What are they needing? What are they wanting? And if that need was met somehow, how do you imagine they would be? And you might just let this image fall away. And just sensing what you might be taking from this. And if you like, you can remain with your eyes closed, or feel free to open your eyes whenever you like. This capacity to role reverse, to sense another's point of view, this is the key to harmony. It doesn't mean you necessarily agree, but it means you have some common ground. When you can understand another's experience, it allows you to actually connect, to find language that they can resonate with. Someone who can really communicate is aware of the motivations behind another, to sense the unmet needs, to sense the driving, the force behind others. And I find it helpful to reflect on just a couple things, because they've increased my sensitivity to others. You may be familiar with the 5 languages of love. It's a very interesting reflection, because we each have ways that we feel loved, that we feel cared for. One of them is our words of affirmation. Another are acts of service, someone actually doing something for you. For others, it's receiving gifts. For others, it's quality time. And for others, it's physical touch. Of course, all of these are wonderful, these 5 ways of expressing love. But I think when you reflect on it, there's oftentimes 1 or 2 that are the real zingers. It might be that when you really have quality time with another, how satisfying that is. For others, receiving gifts really means nothing. But to actually have words of affirmation, it really, really, it fits. So it can be interesting to reflect when there's conflict with others, just to sense which one of these channels is the most effective, what really goes to the heart. And of course, to sense that or imagine that, you have to develop empathy, the capacity to imagine what another person is feeling. When it comes to conflict in the workplace, you might want to back off from the physical touch part, but there might be another workaround. I think that one of the best maps for understanding motivation in ourselves and in others is something the Buddha talked about years ago, and that is the force of the 8 worldly winds. That every one of us, in our intention to move through this life, are all affected by the 8 worldly winds. They're constantly battering us. And they have to do with greed and aversion. Every one of us has a desire to gain, to get things. And with that, a fear of loss. Every one of us desires status, to be seen, to be known, to be respected. And every one of us has a fear of disgrace. Every one of us thrives when we experience praise from others. And we fear blame. Every one of us wants pleasure. And every one of us has an aversion to pain. So when we reflect on conflict with others, it can be interesting to sense which one of these motivators is running really strong through here. And in just asking that question, it opens up a possibility for connection where it didn't exist before. We're generally highly motivated by one of these winds, at least one. And most of us tend to live our lives moving away from others. Some of the most successful people I know in the world are driven by a terror of failure. And when we can recognize these 8 worldly winds and how they drive us personally and how they drive others, new possibilities begin to open up. So as the Buddha kind of codified the Four Noble Truths and the kind of the path, he was really creating riverbanks. That when you have riverbanks, it keeps your intention moving in one direction. So kind of the moral codes, the ethics that comes with practice are really designed to help you move forward. So you'll have better meditations if you're not killing people. You know, your mind will be a little bit clearer if you're not stealing from others. And one of the very profound teachings from the Buddha has to do with wise speech. To be aware of how you use words, and how words can so quickly wound and at the same time so quickly heal. Kind of the summary of wise speech for me comes down to four things: to be kind and to tell the truth, which sometimes feel mutually exclusive. But there has to be a shift in consciousness to be able to both be kind and compassionate and at the same time tell the truth. The third is to be aware of what the other person can hear, to find the language that the other person can actually respond to in a way that is open and keeps the energy flowing. Sometimes that timing, to be aware of the timing is very, very important as well. So all this requires an extraordinary capacity for empathy, to be able to imagine what other people are feeling. And in the Buddha's time, when you look at the list of the rules around wise speech, the lists go on and on and on, because the mind can be pretty crazy. So Joseph Goldstein told this great story of how one of the instructions from the Buddha was to not speak about others unless they were present. So it's basically refraining from gossip. So he thought, I'm taking that one on. I'm not going to talk about anyone unless they're there. And he said he noticed that wiped out about 80% of his conversations. When it comes to wise speech, and for a few moments on this, it really has to do with two basic things. One is around restraint, conscious restraining speech while paying attention. Got to restraint with observation. And so there are four basic areas, which is to restrain yourself from lying or distorting the truth. And when I take that one on, I realize the subtle ways that I will exaggerate something because I really want to get a point across. Or I'll minimize something because I really don't want that known. It's very interesting to pay attention with that intentionality. To be aware of divisive speech. Cutting someone down in the hopes of elevating yourself. To be aware of abusive speech, which is the speech that is designed to create harm, to harm another. And the fourth is to be aware of what's translated as idle chatter or gossip. Now the other side of restraint is the actual practice of wise speech, which is around cultivating kindness.